Someone once described Murnau as a wandering gypsy and a gentleman, which is interesting because they're two totally different things.
F.W. Murnau is one of the key figures in silent film and perhaps in film at all.
Before there were film schools, there was Murnau.
His films are among the greatest motion pictures ever produced.
This was a man who expanded what you do with a motion picture to such a degree that it's almost like he reinvented film.
F.W. Murnau came from a cultured family. He seems to have had quite a privileged childhood. As children, they would go to the theater as often as they could. Then they would come back home.
With his siblings, he would act out shows and invite in people from the neighborhood to see him and his siblings putting on these little performances. And it's pretty clear that from very early, he was the director.
His original name was Friedrich Wilhelm Plumpe. In German, it's not a very nice name.
In German means clumsy. He wouldn't like to call it clumsy. Murnau was raised as Plumpe in Bielefeld, which is a little town in the middle of Germany. Basically, it's the middle of nowhere. Nothing is happening there. If you want to be a teacher, okay, this is a city for you. If you want to be an artist, no, not at all.
Around 1910, he ends up in the town of Murnau, which is a much more fertile atmosphere for a budding artist. He feels himself at home there. He's so taken with the world that he encounters in Murnau that he takes the name of the town himself.
He was an educated man. He knew everything about art. He knew paintings. I don't know if he realized that he was gay when he was still young, but going to Berlin, going to Munich, going to Murnau, think that the art and the artist freed himself.
Being in the theater was not considered a career. And certainly it wasn't considered a career for somebody with Murnau's kind of upbringing.
He did some studies in other subjects, but then sneaked away to the theater and became a disciple of Max Reinhardt, very influential theater director in the teens and 20s in Berlin.
Murnau was definitely involved with the art scene in general in Berlin before World War I. I mean, you had painters and poets and theater people and writers all mingling together. It was extremely exciting and creative.
The First World War was a defining element in the development of F.W. Murnau. The kind of horror that the war represented in terms of trench warfare and in terms of the slaughterhouse that it was definitely caused him to look at life in a much darker and much more pessimistic way. He lost his best friend, who was perhaps also his lover in the war. He was in the Army for a while and then went into the Air Force, and even though he loved flying itself, it was obviously incredibly dangerous. Some reports suggest that he was shot down as many as 8 times. Ultimately, like quite a few others, he supposedly got lost in the fog and ended up in Switzerland. That was intentional on his part to get out of the war. Anybody who had the kind of personality that F.W. Murnau had would have, after a point, looked for a way to get away from this incredible horror of the war itself. And so he was able to do that, and he sat out the end of the war in Switzerland.
When he got out, he went to Berlin.
Berlin in the 20s, there was no heavy moral pressure on artists at that time. You could move freely from one sexual orientation to the other if you want to. Nobody would criticize this. Everybody would only look at the work you're doing.
Murnau saw himself as an artist, and his chosen medium was the cinema.